Some mountain ranges did not go quiet at night. They simply changed what the silence was for. In this episode, there were 9 case files from the Appalachian Mountains, each assembled from partial records, ranger journals, mine inspection notes, trail camera logs, emergency call summaries, and after-action reports. The details did not always agree. The pattern did. If you want more archived case files like these, subscribe to Black Pine Archives and stay to the end. One of these stories left behind a physical sample that should not have existed in that location at all. Lena Marrow had learned to trust routine because routine saved time, and time saved people. She was a volunteer on a search and rescue team in eastern Kentucky, the kind of responder who carried spare batteries sealed in plastic, who could recognize early hypothermia from a voice alone, and who wrote clean notes, even when her hands were shaking. The call came in on a weekday evening in late winter, when the sun went down early and the cold made every simple mistake expensive. A college hiking group had reported one member separated from the rest near a known cave entrance on private adjacent land. The caller described disorientation, a sudden loss of bearings, and a refusal from the missing hiker to move away from the ridgeline, as if he believed something below him was the correct path. Lena was not dispatched alone. 2 other volunteers staged at the nearest paved road with medical gear and rope bags. Lena, because she was the most comfortable in tight spaces, took point with a basic cave kit, a paper topo map, and a handheld GPS unit that she did not fully trust under tree cover. The entrance was smaller than most people expected, a break in limestone tucked behind rhododendron like a mouth that tried to hide itself. The surrounding forest carried the damp hush of a place that rarely saw direct sun. The air coming out of the opening was colder than the air going in, a steady breath that smelled like wet stone and leaf rot. Lena logged the entry with her GPS, watched the screen fight for satellites, then clipped the unit back to her vest and switched to an analog compass out of habit. The needle pointed north at first, clean and steady, the way it did in open woods. Lena stepped closer to the entrance and checked again. Still north. She entered slowly, headlamp angled down to keep her footing sure. The first 20 yards were narrow, then the corridor widened enough to stand upright without scraping her shoulders. The limestone walls were pale where her light touched them, darker where moisture held. Then the needle hesitated. It was subtle at first, a slight tremble as if a finger had tapped the glass. Lena stopped, held the compass level, and waited. The needle twitched once, twice, then began to rotate in a slow circle, smooth and deliberate, as if the concept of north had been unhooked from the world. Compass anomaly localized. From Lena Marrow's field journal, she backed up 2 steps. The needle steadied. She moved forward again. It spun. Lena tested the space the way she had been trained to test anything that felt wrong. She took a careful step left toward the wall. The needle stabilized. She took a careful step right toward the opposite wall. It spun again. The effect was not everywhere in the cave. It was not random. It lived in a specific strip of air, a narrow band that ran parallel to one section of stone like an invisible fence. Her first thought was geology. Magnetite deposits could cause erratic readings, and some caves carried old iron hardware from survey crews or mining attempts. She scanned the floor for metal, for old stakes, for anything that would justify the behavior. She found nothing but damp grit and small stones that looked like the rest of the ridge. The missing hiker was still the priority. Lena keyed her radio and gave a calm update that did not fully match what her body felt. She moved forward, keeping herself left of the band where the compass behaved, staying close to the wall as the passage tightened and then opened into a chamber. The chamber felt taller than it looked. Her light reached upward and returned nothing but darkness. as if the ceiling had pulled away from her beam. Water dripped somewhere out of sight in a steady rhythm that made the air feel measured. The floor was uneven, a mix of limestone shelves and mud pockets where water had pooled and receded. Lena did not call out. Cave acoustics made a simple voice sound like a crowd, and she did not want to feed her own nerves with echoes. She focused on evidence. She swept her headlamp in a slow arc along the nearest wall. That was where she found the marks. They were not the casual scratches of hikers. They were not the soft abrasions of old vandalism. They were sharp, pale lines cut into stone with enough pressure to leave fresh edges. The cuts were grouped in short sets, staggered like wayfinding marks, and they climbed at a consistent height as if made by someone standing upright and moving forward with purpose. The most unsettling detail was their placement. The marks led toward the same wall line where the compass began to spin, the same invisible strip of air that made the needle lose north. Lena photographed the cuts with a reference scale from her kit. She then knelt carefully, avoided disturbing the floor, and collected a pinch of stone dust from beneath the freshest marks. She sealed it in a clean evidence envelope. The team kept for medication bottles, torn ID cards, and anything that might help reconstruct a timeline. Fresh incisions noted, dust collected beneath active cut. From a SAR evidence note, her radio hissed faintly with static that did not sound like distance. It sounded like interference, the kind of interference that came from something close. Lena stepped back and watched the compass again. The needle did not merely wobble now, it turned with confidence, circling the dial as if it was following a track no human map could show. She moved a foot away from the band. It steadied. She moved back into it. It spun. She called for her team lead to bring the magnetometer. The device was used for occasional searches near old sites, where metal evidence mattered, and it was calibrated enough to pick up anomalies that a compass could not quantify. The lead arrived minutes later, moving carefully, breathing slower than normal, treating the cave like a place where mistakes had teeth. He held the magnetometer close to the wall, away from Lena's headlamp to avoid glare. The device stayed flat for a few seconds, then spiked sharply as he crossed the same invisible boundary. Magnetic reading spike. From a handheld meter log, SAR equipment checkout. He moved the meter away. The reading dropped. He moved it back. It spiked again, in the same narrow band, as if the rock carried a seam of abnormal field strength or a hidden structure behind it. Neither of them could find visible cause. No exposed metal, no wiring, no survey rods. Just limestone that looked like limestone. They continued searching for the missing hiker, while keeping the anomalous wall in their peripheral awareness like a person you did not want to turn your back on. They found no body, no voice, no abandoned pack. But Lena noticed something else as they moved across the chamber floor. Scuff marks. They were not random boot prints. They were shallow arcs, repeated in the same short path, as if someone had walked back and forth along the same line, unsure of the correct direction. The scuffs led toward the wall where the compass spun and ended there. Not at a turn, not at a drop, not at a natural barrier. They ended at stone, as if the person making them had walked right up to the wall and then stopped, leaving the kind of trace a human body usually left behind. Lena documented the scuffs and took photos from multiple angles. The team lead marked the location on the paper map because the GPS was still unreliable and because paper did not glitch. On the way out, the cave felt different. Not louder, not colder, simply more aware. Lena could not explain it with temperature or airflow, but she began to feel the way she felt when a storm was about to break. A subtle pressure in the body that insisted something was changing, even if the sky looked the same. Back at the staging point, the missing hiker was found by a separate team on the ridgeline. Alive, confused, dehydrated and unable to explain why he had been drawn toward the cave entrance in the first place. He said he had thought he heard his friends inside, even though no one had gone in. Subject reported auditory confusion and strong urge to return toward the opening. From a medical intake note, the case should have ended with a warning and a clean report. Instead, a ranger unit arrived later that night, after SAR had cleared, and cited the college group for unauthorized cave entry, insisting signage had been posted and ignored. Cave entry unauthorized. From a ranger incident report, Lena read that line twice when she received the incident copy. The group had not entered the cave. SAR had. Under the conditions of an active rescue call, access was permitted. The ranger report did not reflect that nuance. It treated the entry like trespass, like curiosity, like the cave itself had become something the paperwork needed to frame as human fault. Lena kept her own documentation. She kept the photos. She kept the magnetometer log. She kept the stone dust envelope. Weeks later, a geology lab at a community college agreed to compare her dust sample to local cave limestone. The result came back with a mismatch that did not make sense in simple terms. The mineral content carried trace elements more consistent with mine tailings from a different county, several ridges away. It did not match the ridge the cave sat on. Lena did not claim to understand what that meant. She only understood what it implied. Fresh stone shavings from one wall of one cave seemed to belong somewhere else entirely, as if the wall had been cut from a different place and installed into the mountain like a panel, or as if the mountain had learned how to trade pieces of itself. She started a folder after that, not as a superstition but as an archive, a place to store anomalies that shared a quiet logic, localized field distortion, root-like marks, evidence that arrived with the wrong geography, and the feeling that certain places did not merely confuse navigation, they redirected it. Archival transition. The next case began less than a week later, farther south, where the mountains were honeycombed with old infrastructure that was supposed to be dead. Travis Kincaid had made a living out of places people liked to pretend were finished. Decommissioned mills, condemned tunnels, sealed shafts on state land that still pulled teenagers and urban explorers the way broken glass pulled light. His contract work was written in neutral language and paid in slow, careful hours. Verify lockouts, document hazards, tag what could still move, and leave a paper trail strong enough to keep a lawsuit from blooming years later. In late November, he was assigned to a hillside mine portal that had been officially closed since the last century. The file described it as a legacy site with unstable timbering, standing water, and a history of unauthorized entry. Travis expected a rusted gate, old warning placards, and the stale smell of damp stone. He found all of that. What he did not expect was the elevator. The portal sat back from the access road, tucked behind second-growth trees and a slope of broken shale. Chain-link fencing wrapped the opening with new padlocks that looked out of place against older steel. Signs were bolted at eye level. No entry, bad air, structural failure, state closure order. The kind of signage that assumed fear could substitute for curiosity. Travis logged the arrival time, photographed the fence line, and stepped inside with a lockout kit, a gas meter, and a flashlight bright enough to turn dust into weather. The air in the entry drifted cold and metallic. Water ran somewhere deeper in, steady and patient. The service elevator was positioned in the main shaft like a rib left behind. A metal cage, a sliding gate, a call panel mounted to the wall beside it. Everything looked inert. Everything looked dead. He checked the obvious first. The breaker room sat off to the side behind a warped steel door. Inside, the panel was tagged and sealed, the way closure orders required. Travis cut the seal, opened the panel, and found what the paperwork had promised. The main disconnect was off, the lockout tags were old but valid, and the feed lines had been physically cut and capped years ago. Lift power cut. From an on-site inspection note. He confirmed with his voltage tester anyway. Nothing at the terminals, no hum, no residual. The mine felt electrically empty in the way caves felt empty of sunlight. Travis stepped back into the shaft corridor and let his flashlight pass over the elevator cage. He was already thinking about how quickly he could finish the checklist and get back to daylight when the call panel caught his eye. The down arrow glowed. It was not faint. It was not a dying LED blinking on a weak battery. It shone with a steady, clean intensity, as if the system had been powered all along and had simply waited for someone to notice. Travis stood still long enough to hear his own breathing inside his respirator. The light did not change. It did not flicker in response to his movement. It remained patient. Button illuminated. From a site photo attachment. He photographed it from multiple angles the way he was trained to photograph anything that could later be argued. Wide shot for location, mid shot for context, close shot for detail. He captured the panel, the cage, the tags on the breaker, the cut feed lines in the open panel room, then returned to the call button again, as if the camera could persuade the world back into coherence. The light continued to glow in every frame. His first explanation was chemical. Some old emergency circuit, some independent battery system left behind, a maintenance retrofit that never made it into the closure file. That kind of thing happened in industrial history more often than people admitted. He opened the panel housing beside the call button and found no battery pack, no backup line, no hidden transformer. The wiring behind the panel looked aged and incomplete. Several leads ended in cut sheathing that had been folded back and taped as if someone had once removed a section and never bothered to make it neat. Travis tried the simplest test left. He pressed the down arrow, the button depressed with a familiar click. The cage shuddered, not like something failing, but like something waking. The gate rattled once against its track. Then the elevator began to move. It descended smoothly, without grinding, without protesting, without the metallic shriek Travis had expected from a system abandoned for decades. The sensation was wrong in the way a clean heartbeat was wrong inside a corpse. Travis kept his feet planted and his hand close to the gate. He watched the shaft opening above as it slid upward out of view, swallowed by darkness. The down arrow remained lit as if the decision had been approved. The cage stopped after a single level, settling with a soft, mechanical certainty. The gate did not open by itself. Nothing invited him out, but the landing beyond the cage looked intact. In the beam of his flashlight, a short platform dusted in fine grit, with a handrail that had not collapsed. Travis stepped out. The air was colder here, heavier, wet enough to cling to the inside of his mask. His gas meter stayed calm, offering him the one mercy of normal readings. The smell was old water and iron, like a bucket left out in the rain for too long. Then he heard footsteps above him, not a rockfall, not the random slide of gravel. The sound had cadence and weight, a measured gait directly overhead, circling the shaft opening where the cage had just been. The steps did not rush. They did not hesitate. They moved with the confidence of something that knew the shape of the space by memory. Travis lifted his light to the ceiling out of reflex, even though there was nothing to illuminate except shadow. The footsteps continued, then paused, then resumed on the far side, as if something had crossed directly over the shaft, in a place where there should have been nothing to stand on. He recorded the sound without thinking because he had learned that disbelief did not matter in a report unless it came with a file attached. Audio captures footsteps. From a phone recording log, the recording caught the steps clearly. It also caught something underneath them, a faint, repeated click, spaced evenly in time, like a metronome marking seconds in a room with no clocks. The click did not match the cadence of the footsteps. It persisted when the steps paused. It continued like a separate mechanism, steady and indifferent. Travis looked up again. He saw no beam supports close enough to explain the sound. He saw no ladder, no platform, no secondary walkway. The shaft above was an empty vertical throat. He turned back to the cage. The call panel on the cage itself was dark. No up arrow illuminated, no emergency light. The interior did not look powered. Only the wall panel outside the cage had given him that single, steady down arrow, like a directive rather than an option. He pressed the up button inside the cage anyway. Nothing happened. He stepped out again and pressed the up button on the wall panel. Nothing happened. The down arrow glowed as steady as ever. It did not pulse. It did not blink. It simply waited as if it had never promised him a way back. Travis felt a shift in his own body first, a sudden awareness of sweat along his spine under layers that should have kept him cold. He thought of the mine file's bland warnings about structural instability and water ingress, and understood that none of those hazards were the one he needed to fear. The footsteps started again overhead, slower now, directly above the cage opening. The metronome click continued beneath them, unwavering. Travis did what his job had taught him to do when a system behaved unpredictably. He tried to halt motion before it became irreversible. He forced the cage gate open enough to jam a tool into the track and wedge the mechanism. The metal protested with a strained squeal that sounded almost alive. The cage shuddered as if it disliked being denied, then held. He did not wait to see whether it would forgive him. He moved along the landing, scanning for anything that could anchor his report in ordinary reality. A posted diagram, a maintenance log, a serial plate, a stamped label that could be traced to a manufacturer with a phone number. He found a rusted mine safety plate bolted to a support beam. The plate had been sanded by time, but not erased. A date was stamped into it in block characters, the kind used to mark inspections and certifications. The date was wrong. The mine's closure paperwork listed final operations, ending in the 1990s with equipment dismantled and power severed soon after. The plate carried an inspection year stamped as 2031, as if someone had certified this dead elevator in a future that had not happened yet. Travis photographed the plate with shaking hands. He tried to keep steady. Date on safety plate inconsistent with closure file. From Travis Kincaid's personal field note. The footsteps stopped abruptly, as if the sound had been listening for his attention and had received it. The metronome click continued for a few more beats, then ceased as well, leaving a silence so complete it felt manufactured. Travis returned to the cage. The down arrow still glowed. He did not press it again. He climbed out through the landing corridor and followed the mine's lower access route, a narrow service passage marked on his map as a ventilation connection. The route was steeper and tighter than the main shaft. Water ran in thin sheets down the rock. The air grew colder the farther he went. More than once he felt the sense of space compressing behind him, not as a physical shift, but as a pressure in the mind that suggested the mine did not like being abandoned. When he finally reached daylight, it came through a secondary portal hidden under brush, a hole that looked less like an exit and more like a place the mountain forgot to finish swallowing. Travis stepped out into air that should have felt clean and found himself breathing hard, as if he had been running. His keys were cold in his hand. His shirt clung to his back with sweat he had not earned through labor. His flashlight beam looked too bright in open air, like he had brought something unnatural out with him. He filed the official report the way contracts required. He listed hazards that fit the template: unstable structures, trip risk, water pooling. unauthorized access concern. He attached photographs of the fence line and the tagged breaker panel and the cut feed lines. He did not attach the photo of the illuminated down arrow. He did not attach the audio of the footsteps. He did not attach the plate stamped with a year that should not exist yet. The follow-up protocol returned with a signature and a note about securing the gate more thoroughly. It contained no mention of anything powered, no mention of any elevator movement, no mention of sound, site condition consistent with decommissioned status. From a follow-up review summary, Travis kept the missing pieces in a separate folder on a personal drive. The mine had been dead on paper. In the dark, it had behaved like a system that still remembered what it was built to do. It had accepted input. It had chosen a direction. It had refused to offer the other, and something had walked above him, step by step, in a place where nothing should have been able to walk at all. Archival transition. After the mine, the next evidence arrived already labeled, already intimate, as if the mountain wanted the file to be personal. The call arrived as the kind of thing county offices filed under routine, the sort of report that usually ended with a shrug and a short note in a database. A hunter had spotted a hardhat in a ravine near an old adit and flagged it as possible evidence of trespassing. The area had a reputation for that. People treated old mine entries like dare you spots, proof of courage detours, and sometimes, in the worst seasons, like convenient places to disappear for a few hours and make their families frantic. Deputy Rafe Tolliver took the dispatch because he was close, because it was slow, and because nobody expected a helmet to change anything. The ravine sat behind a logging spur that narrowed into a track only locals used. Rafe parked where the trees opened just enough to keep his cruiser from scraping bark. He walked in with a small evidence kit, gloves, flagging tape, and a camera he did not trust, but still used because paperwork demanded pictures. The air was winter clear, with the smell of leaf mold and cold stone. The mine adit itself was higher up on the slope, half collapsed, screened by vine and brush that had grown back like a bandage. The hunter, a man with mud on his boots and a careful distance in his eyes, pointed down into the ravine without stepping closer. The hardhat sat upright on a flat rock as if set there deliberately. It was not lodged in roots or wedged by runoff. It was not half buried the way trash became when a season went by. It looked placed, centered, stable, a bright object in the middle of muted winter ground. Rafe took photographs before touching anything. Wide shot for context, mid shot for position, close shot for detail. The helmet's exterior was scuffed and dull, the kind of wear that came from real work. That should have made it ordinary. It did not. When he lifted it with gloved hands, he felt the first wrongness. The weight. Not massively heavier, not enough to be dramatic, but enough that his wrist registered it as loaded with more than plastic and air. Soil, he assumed at first. Moisture, packed grit, the normal burden of a thing that had been on the ground. He turned it over and saw the inside. A name had been scratched into the liner, carved from the interior out, deep enough to catch his flashlight beam and throw it back in pale lines. Not printed, not stickered, not marker on plastic. It had the desperate permanence of someone who did not trust labels to survive. The name was Harlan Stowe. Rafe did not recognize it immediately, but his mind marked it as specific, not the kind of name a prank would choose. He photographed the carving, then paused long enough to feel that quiet shift responders sometimes felt when a small find became a thread. The soil under the helmet's rim was thick and packed into the suspension straps. He scraped a small amount into a sterile vial, then looked at it under the beam. The clay in that county ran red-brown and gritty, the kind of dirt that left a rusty stain on skin. This dirt was darker, finer, almost oily. It clung to the glove like paste. Soil mismatch suspected. From an evidence intake protocol, he bagged the helmet, sealed it, and logged the location. He asked the hunter the standard questions, not as conversation, but as procedure. How long had he been in the area? Whether anyone else had been with him, whether he had moved anything. The hunter's answers were clean and repetitive, as if he wanted the entire moment to end. Back at the station, Rafe entered the name into the county system. Nothing local came back. Then he searched across linked bulletins and found a missing persons notice from a neighboring county issued earlier that year. The photograph showed a man in his late 30s with tired eyes and a work badge clipped to his jacket. The notice included a detail that tightened the case from vague to personal. He had been a mine maintenance contractor. The bulletin mentioned he had last been seen near a different ridge system altogether, a drive away on a site that had its own closure orders and its own history of people ignoring them. The helmet in Rafe's evidence bag matched the type listed in the report, down to the manufacturer markings on the brim. Missing person wore similar. From a sheriff's report addendum, the next step was not mystery, it was protocol. Rafe submitted a soil sample for basic profiling through a regional lab that handled everything from narcotics residue to agricultural runoff. The request was written in careful language. Compare composition, identify anomalies, note whether local match was plausible. He did not write what he was thinking, because what he was thinking was not a category the forms allowed. The results came back within a week, crisp and impersonal. The mineral profile differed from local ground composition. Trace elements suggested a different bedrock signature, more consistent with eastern strip mine tailings than the ravine soil where the helmet had been found. Mineral profile differs. From a soil analysis summary, if the helmet belonged to Harlan Stowe, and if the soil on it belonged to another region, then the helmet had traveled. That was the simplest interpretation. Evidence moved all the time. People carried things. Water carried things. Animals dragged things. So Rafe went back to the ravine with a ranger team and treated the place like a scene instead of a curiosity. They walked the slope above the placement rock. No drag marks, no scuffs, no crushed leaves leading in. They checked the ravine bottom for signs of wash-in, debris lines, leaf piles caught on branches, any indication a recent storm had rolled an object downhill and conveniently stood it upright. The leaves around the rock lay undisturbed, flat and dry in their own slow decomposition. The rock itself had no scraped edges. Nothing suggested impact or tumble. They searched for prints, even though winter ground was a poor witness. If someone had carried the helmet down, they should have left some story. A boot slide, a broken twig, a disturbed patch of moss. The ravine offered none. It looked like a place that had been waiting. Rafe returned to the old adit and examined the entrance from a distance. The warning signage was faded. The fence line in front of it had been cut and retwisted enough times to tell a quiet history of repeated trespass. But there was nothing near it that explained a helmet arriving from another ridge system. He did not say it out loud, not to the rangers, not in the report, not even to himself in a way that felt like belief. But the pattern from earlier files pressed against his thinking anyway. Objects that appeared staged, evidence that carried the wrong signature, personal identifiers scratched where they could not be erased. The helmet was not just a helmet, it was a message, and the message was intimate. It had a name in it. It had earth from somewhere else. It had arrived without leaving a path. Rafe spoke into a private voice memo later that night, the kind he used when he needed to drain a thought before sleep. He kept it short because long explanations made it feel more unreal. I do not understand how it got there without tracks. From Deputy Tolliver's personal voice memo. The dirt is not from our county. It is not even close. From Deputy Tolliver's personal voice memo, the county's formal process moved slowly. They forwarded the helmet details to the neighboring jurisdiction. They compared photographs. They cross-checked the carving against the missing man's records. They waited for next-of-kin confirmation. They did everything the right way. No one could confirm where Harlan Stowe had gone. No one could confirm that the helmet had been with him at the moment he vanished. The evidence proved only that a helmet with his name existed and that it carried earth that did not belong to the ravine, which meant the artifact did what the growing file seemed designed to do. It widened the circle without closing it. It connected counties. It suggested movement without routes. It made the mountains feel less like separate ridges and more like a single system, with shared pockets, shared seams, and a way of passing things between them. The helmet went into storage under a case number that should have made it safe. Rafe checked on it once, weeks later, and found that the bag seal was intact and the paperwork clean. What unsettled him was smaller. The soil residue along the helmet's rim looked darker than it had before, as if it had stayed wet in a room that was supposed to be dry, as if the wrong earth refused to become ordinary. Archival transition. The next file did not arrive in a hand. It arrived as a rhythm, recorded by a machine that triggered on movement and then found nothing. Kara Whitlow lived on the edge of a map that never felt finished. Her property line ran along a fence that stopped mattering the moment the national forest began, and she had learned that the woods did not respect the neat geometry of deeds and survey stakes. The land behind her house sloped into mixed hardwood and pine, stitched with old game trails, seasonal drainage cuts, and the faint scars of logging that had ended before she was born. She used trail cameras the way other people used porch lights, not because she expected monsters, but because she liked a quiet proof that the night had passed in a normal way. A doe with a limp, a black bear and her yearling, a neighbor's dog wandering too far. The cameras gave her routine back in places where routine was easy to lose. The camera that started the file was mounted on a beach trunk near a narrow game trail that paralleled a shallow creek. Kara had placed it at chest height, angled slightly downward, with motion sensitivity set to medium and audio capture enabled. The model was new enough to time-stamp clips, log trigger events, and export a clean record of activity to an SD card without much battery drain. She checked it once a week, more out of habit than concern. That week, a cold snap came early. The night air turned dry and sharp. Tree limbs made small cracking sounds that carried farther than they should have. The creek ran quieter, as if the water itself had drawn in its breath. Just after midnight, Kara's phone buzzed with a motion alert. She expected a deer. The preview image showed empty brush and a slice of trail, the kind of frame that usually meant a fox had moved too fast or a raccoon had passed just out of view. Kara watched the short clip. The scene remained still. Leaves trembled slightly at the edge of the frame, but there was no body, no eyeshine, no movement that explained the trigger. She shrugged, chalked it up to wind, and went back to sleep. 33 minutes later, the phone buzzed again. Same camera, same angle, same empty trail. Kara sat up, the first unease arriving not from what she saw, but from the exactness of the timing. Forest activity was messy. Even predators moved with irregularity. A camera might trigger twice in a minute, then stay quiet for hours. Nothing in the woods behaved like a clock unless someone made it behave that way. 33 minutes later, the notification came again, and again. By the time the sky began to pale behind the trees, the camera had triggered on that fixed interval, enough times to feel like a pattern rather than a malfunction. Kara scrolled through the alerts and felt the oddness tighten in her chest. The timestamps did not drift. They did not clump. They did not skip. They arrived like a metronome that did not need music. Trigger interval 33 minutes. From trail cam log export at first light, Kara walked out with a thermos and a head full of ordinary explanations. She told herself it was a battery issue, a sensitivity glitch, a branch bouncing in and out of the sensor's detection cone. She reached the beach trunk and stopped long enough to look around before touching anything. The trail was damp but not muddy. The ground held deer prints and the small, delicate marks of turkey. Nothing looked churned. Nothing looked newly disturbed. The brush in the frame stood as it had the night before, bent only by its own weight. She opened the camera housing, removed the SD card, and replaced it with a spare. She checked the battery level. It was strong. She checked the mount. It was tight. She waved a hand in front of the lens. The sensor reacted normally. She spoke near the mic and heard her own voice on playback, crisp and close, just as it should have been. Back inside, Kara reviewed the footage on a laptop at her kitchen table. She did it the way she handled invoices and property paperwork, slow, methodical, unwilling to let panic write the narrative. The clips were nearly identical. Empty trail, empty brush, a faint tremor in the leaves that could have been breeze, except the canopy was still. The lighting did not change much from one clip to the next, which meant the triggers were not being caused by shifting shadows. The camera did not tilt. The lens did not fog. Nothing stepped into frame. She began taking notes on paper because the act of writing kept her anchored. Clip count, timestamps, battery level, settings, weather. She wrote one line again and again, as if repetition could make it less strange. No subject visible. From a review note in the property log, and then she listened with headphones. The audio was not silence. It held the familiar thin background of night in the mountains. Distant creek noise, occasional insect clicks, even in cold, the soft interference of electronics. But threaded through each clip, right at the moment the camera triggered, there was a low thump. One heavy impact on damp ground, not a branch breaking, not something scuttling, not an acorn striking leaves. The sound had weight. It was deeper than most natural knocks, a short, blunt pressure that seemed to travel through earth before it traveled through air. A moment later came a faint secondary sound, softer and shorter, like weight shifting off a heel. The thump repeated with the same cadence every time. Kara played the clips back to back and felt her mind reject the idea her ears insisted on. It sounded like a single step taken by something heavy enough to compress soil, followed by a subtle adjustment, like the end of a stride, but the frame stayed empty. She exported the audio from several clips and opened a basic waveform viewer. She was not a specialist, but she knew enough to see patterns. The spikes were consistent, sharp, and low frequency, appearing at the same relative moment in each recording, as if someone had pressed a finger onto the timeline and marked it. Audio contains low thump. From a waveform analysis note, Kara did not call the sheriff. She had no interest in being laughed out of a dispatch queue. Instead, she called a ranger she knew from boundary disputes and wildfire warnings, a man who had helped her once when trespassers cut her fence. He came that afternoon not with theatrics, but with a notebook and the tired practicality of someone who had heard too many stories that ended up being human behavior. He walked the trail, checked the camera placement, and listened to the audio on Kara's laptop without interrupting. His first conclusion was what Kara had wanted him to say. Equipment sensitivity, sensor misread, a harmless technical loop. He suggested relocating the camera 5 yards to change the detection angle and cut whatever was triggering it. They moved it 5 yards. They waited 33 minutes after the last overnight trigger time. The camera recorded again. Empty frame. Low thump. They moved it 10 yards to a different trunk near the same trail, with a new background and a slightly different lighting pattern. 33 minutes later, it triggered again. Same thump. Same empty trail. The ranger's face changed then, not into fear exactly, but into a kind of quiet focus he used when a situation stopped fitting into the easy boxes. He walked the ground where the camera had been pointed during each trigger. The soil was soft enough to show deer prints. It held their clean edges. It should have held anything heavy. It held nothing new. He knelt and ran his gloved fingers along a patch of leaf litter where the thump seemed to come from, based on audio direction. There was no depression, no scuff, no drag line. The leaves lay as if untouched. He made a note in the way officials did when they needed language that did not embarrass them later. Repeated activation with no visible subject. From a ranger field note, Kara handed him the SD card from the first camera placement, plus a printed export of the trigger log. She labeled the card with date and location in black ink and sealed it in a small plastic bag, the way she sealed tax documents. It felt absurd, but it also felt necessary. Evidence was safer when it was treated like evidence. The ranger took the materials back to his office and forwarded them to a wildlife tech who sometimes helped with nuisance animal cases. The tech reviewed the footage on a larger screen, adjusted contrast, slowed frames, and scrubbed the timeline for artifacts. The conclusion returned 2 days later in a short email that tried to be helpful without sounding supernatural. The motion sensor had triggered as if something had moved close to the lens. The audio thump aligned with the trigger moment. The frame remained empty. No known animal profile matched a repeated single-step pattern at that fixed interval. No insect activity was visible close enough to the lens to explain it. Kara kept the email. She also kept listening. Once she heard the step clearly, she started noticing what came with it. A faint hush just before the impact, like pressure building, a slight change in background noise, as if the air itself had been dampened. The creak sound would thin for a fraction of a second, then resume. The thump arrived, and everything went back to normal. It began to feel less like a footfall and more like a system completing a cycle. Kara attempted to break the cycle. She removed the camera entirely and left the tree bare. She placed a different camera on a different trail a quarter-mile away, closer to her back fence line. She adjusted sensitivity lower. She turned audio off and then back on. She changed batteries. She changed SD cards. She changed everything that could reasonably be changed. On the first night the second camera ran, it stayed quiet. On the second night, it triggered once, just after midnight. Empty brush, empty trail, low thump. 33 minutes later, it triggered again. Kara did not sleep much after that. She began timing her own movements by the pattern, listening for the sound not through a speaker, but through the dark itself, as if the forest might start making it audible without electronics. She never heard it with her bare ears, but the cameras heard it, and the cameras kept time. A week after the first alerts, the ranger returned with a second unit and did the kind of check that was supposed to settle questions. They walked the trail at the moment a trigger was expected. They stood in the camera's field of view. They made noise. They stayed still. They stepped out and back in. The camera behaved normally when humans touched the variables. Then they left the area and waited at Kara's porch where the forest line began. At the interval, the camera triggered again. The clip showed empty trail. The audio recorded one step. The ranger did not say much afterward. He simply asked Kara to keep the SD cards and log exports in a safe place and to call if the pattern changed in any way. The request was practical, but the tone carried something else, an admission that the file had become bigger than one property and one camera. Kara's physical evidence was simple and stubborn. An SD card, a log export, repeated timestamps, audio spikes with consistent signature, a set of empty frames that should have contained something. What it suggested was harder to write down, that the forest could pace itself, that it could keep a schedule, that it could perform movement without needing to show a body. that a step could exist as sound and timing alone, leaving no track because there was no weight to press into earth, only the imitation of weight, repeated patiently until someone noticed. Kara recorded her own short statement for the file because she did not trust memory to stay clean around something like this. It happened like a timer, not like an animal. From Kara Whitlow's written statement, "I watched the footage until I could predict it, and that made it worse." From Kara Whitlow's written statement, "After that month, the camera triggers stopped as abruptly as they had begun. The forest went back to irregular life. Deer returned. Bears passed through. Wind finally did what wind was supposed to do. But Kara kept the first SD card in a sealed envelope, in a locked drawer, because the pattern felt less like a glitch that ended and more like a test that concluded. As if something had proven it could knock on the world at a fixed interval, heard by machines, ignored by soil, and then simply moved on. Archival transition. After the camera's rhythm came the next contradiction. Wet evidence without weather, like a person-shaped presence pressing itself into fabric. Elliot Bram and his older brother Jonah treated the Appalachian backcountry the way some people treated a gym. They did not go out to prove anything to strangers. They went because repetition made them feel capable, and capability was a kind of comfort they could carry back into their work weeks. Elliot was the one who obsessed over details. Jonah was the one who kept things simple. Between them, they rarely made stupid mistakes. Before the trip, Elliot checked the forecast from 2 sources and wrote the key points in his notes app out of habit. Clear skies, low humidity, temperatures dropping below freezing after midnight. No precipitation in the window they planned to camp. He also checked a nearby weather station history because the mountains like to lie about chance the way they like to lie about cell service. No precipitation. From a weather station excerpt, they hiked up to a ridge spur, known locally for its overlook and its isolation. It was not a secret place, but it was far enough off the common loop trails that you had to want it. The last mile rose through a corridor of rhododendron and rock, then opened to a narrow shelf where the wind came clean and steady. The trees there were shorter and older, twisted by seasons and lightning. The ground was mostly packed leaf litter over hard soil, with patches of dry grass and exposed stone. They picked a site with drainage and wind cover, tucked behind a low line of boulders. They pitched the tent so the door faced away from the strongest gusts. They staked it down tight. They cooked a simple meal, kept their headlamps on low to preserve night vision, and talked just enough to settle into the quiet without feeding it. By the time they zipped up for the night, the sky was so clear it looked sharpened. The stars felt close. The ridge air carried the clean smell of cold rock and pine. There was no mist, no drizzle, no hint of weather moving in. Elliot fell asleep thinking they had done everything right. Sometime after midnight, he woke to a sound that did not belong to wind. It was fabric moving against fabric, slow and deliberate, like a palm flattening against nylon. Not a slap, not a scrape. A pressure sound, the kind you heard when someone leaned a hand against a rain jacket and slowly dragged it an inch. Elliot held his breath and listened. He did not hear footsteps in leaf litter. He did not hear a zipper. He did not hear twigs snapping. The ridge had its usual night noises, muted by cold. A distant creak in branches, the faint shift of tent lines under wind tension, Jonah's sleeping breath. But the pressure sound came again, closer to the door seam, like someone had found the exact spot where the tent was weakest and tested it. Elliot turned his headlamp on. The beam hit the inner wall and revealed wet marks on the tent fabric near the door seam. They were not splatter patterns. They were not condensation beads. They were shaped, smeared in the outline of fingers and the heel of a hand pressed from the outside. The fingers looked long in a way that could have been angle or could have been something else. The palm area was darker, as if more force had been applied there. Wet marks on tent. From scene photographs, Elliot's first thought was that Jonah had stepped outside, touched the tent, and come back in without waking him. That thought lasted less than a second because Jonah's sleeping shape was still beside him, shoulders rising and falling slow and steady. Elliot nudged Jonah hard enough to wake him. Jonah blinked, confused, then focused when he saw Elliot's face and the light and the wet print. They stayed quiet because quiet was the only way to measure the world outside. Elliot listened for movement. He heard nothing. The ridge wind continued as it had before, steady and indifferent. The handprint was still there. It did not drip. It did not spread like water soaking into cloth. It sat on the nylon like a stain that had already decided its boundaries. Jonah reached out and touched the inside of the fabric where the palm mark was. The tent wall was cold. The wetness seemed to be on the outside only, but the pressure had flattened fibers and seams, as if real skin had pressed in hard enough to change the shape of the material. Elliot did what people did when their fear demanded documentation. He took photos with his phone, making sure the headlamp illuminated the print from the side so the outline showed. He filmed a short clip to capture the way the moisture reflected light. He checked his own hands as if he might have sleepwalked and forgotten. His fingers were dry and cracked from cold. He opened his phone and called emergency services even though he knew the ridge was a dead zone. The call attempted, failed, attempted again. On the third try, a thin bar appeared, and the line connected with a hiss of static like a rope fraying under tension. He reported a presence outside the tent. He reported a wet handprint on the fabric. He reported no rain and no tracks, and no sounds besides the pressure. The dispatcher asked standard questions. The answers did not fit standard categories. The connection dropped twice. Camper panic call. From a 911 summary, they did not leave the tent that night, not because they thought the ridge was surrounded, but because they understood the risk of stepping out into darkness when your brain had already decided the world was wrong. They sat with the headlamp off to preserve battery, listening for any return of the pressure sound. It did not come again. That made it worse. When dawn finally bled into the tree line, the world looked normal again in the way mountains often did after a bad night. The ridge rocks were rimed with frost. The air was bright and clean. The tent lines were stiff. The sky stayed cloudless. The wet print remained. Outside the tent, the soil around their site was dry enough to show scuffs clearly. Their own boot prints were there, leading to a flat rock where Jonah had stood while staking out the guy lines. There were deer tracks farther down the slope, but around the door seam, where someone would have had to stand to press a hand, there were no prints, no heel marks, no toe scuffs, no disturbance in leaf litter that matched a human stance. The only change was the tent fabric itself, flattened where the palm had leaned in. Elliot walked a slow circle around the site, scanning the ridge edge and the tree line. He found nothing that made sense as an intruder's approach route. No broken branches, no disturbed brush, no sign of someone crouching. The ridge offered few places to hide, which should have been comforting. Instead, it made the missing evidence feel intentional. He returned to the tent and touched the outside of the print with a gloved finger. The moisture was real. It chilled the fabric in a way that felt deeper than water. It smelled faintly of cold stone and old leaves, the kind of scent that came from caves and shaded hollows where sunlight did not linger. They broke camp quickly, but Elliot did not let the evidence go. He cut a small section of the tent material that included part of the handprint, choosing a spot that would not ruin the shelter completely but would preserve the outline. He sealed it in a plastic bag, then in a second bag, then wrapped it in a spare shirt to keep it from warming too fast in the sun. The act was instinctive, like someone saving a splinter because the wound mattered. The strange part was how long the wetness stayed wet. They hiked down for hours. The sun rose higher. Their breath stopped fogging the air. The moisture on the fabric sample should have evaporated with warmth and movement. It did not. The handprint remained glossy in the bag, as if the moisture did not follow the usual schedule for water. Elliot checked it at the trailhead and felt his stomach tighten. The shape looked clearer now, not more faded. The edges held. By the time they reached cell service and called again, the sheriff's office treated it as a probable prank or an animal encounter, misread in the dark. A deputy agreed to meet them at a ranger station later that day to take a statement and photograph the sample. Elliot did not fight for belief. He fought for record. His statement was short and careful. He described forecast. He described time. He described the sound of pressure on fabric. He described the handprint shape and the lack of tracks. He handed over photos and the bagged sample. He did not embellish because the raw facts were already too sharp. The deputy documented what he could without naming what he could not. He included the weather excerpt, the photographs, the emergency call summary, and the physical fabric sample, logged as a recovered item from a reported disturbance. Fabric fibers flattened consistent with external pressure. From an evidence intake note days later, when Elliot retrieved the sample back for his own records, the wetness had finally dried. It did not dry like ordinary moisture. It left behind a faint residue line where the fingers had been, a slightly darker trace that clung to the nylon weave as if something had been pressed into it rather than simply placed on it. The residue still carried that same smell when the bag was opened. Cold stone, old leaves, and something metallic so faint it could have been imagination. Elliot wrote his own private note after the official paperwork ended, because the official language did not hold the truth of how it felt. It did not tap or scratch like an animal. From Elliot Bram's personal note, it pressed like a person deciding whether to come in. From Elliot Bram's personal note, the evidence ladder in the file was plain and brutal. Witness fear, photographs, weather record, emergency call, physical fabric sample. It was enough to prove something happened on that ridge in a clear, dry night. It was not enough to explain what kind of hand left moisture without rain, and why it left no footprints in ground soft enough to hold even the lightest deer track. Archival transition. The next object was a warning nailed to wood in a place with no official signage, like a message left for the next person who still believed the trail was ordinary. It began as cleanup work, not mystery. A maintenance crew from the county road department was clearing blowdown after a late-season storm that had snapped limbs and pushed a few old trees across an access spur. Their assignment was practical. Clear what blocked the service road, document damage, flag anything that looked like it could slide later. Most of them had done the same route for years. They knew which culverts washed out first, which stretches stayed muddy, and which abandoned footpaths still tempted locals who wanted real woods without the inconvenience of official trailheads. Near the edge of an old trail that had fallen out of sanctioned use, one of the crew members noticed fresh wood where fresh wood did not belong. A board had been nailed to a tree at shoulder height, square and new against the bark. The nails were modern. The board had been cut clean. The message was carved deep enough that the gouges held shadow even in daylight. Do not listen to the quiet. The crew took photographs because it looked like liability. They logged the location because the county logged everything. They reported it as vandalism with an unease they did not name. Warning sign recovered. From a recovery protocol, the ranger assigned to follow up was named Miles Treadwell, and he approached the report the way he approached most small oddities. He expected prank behavior. A local legend attempt. Teenagers trying to scare each other. He brought gloves, a camera, an evidence bag, and a small recorder because anything nailed to public land became a record once it entered his day. He found the sign exactly where the crew said it was, nailed to a tree beside the old trail. Up close, the carving looked less like casual whittling and more like deliberate lettering made by someone who wanted it readable from a distance. The grooves were deep and clean with pale, exposed wood that had not yet darkened with weather. Miles photographed it from multiple angles. He checked the nails. He checked the bark around them for tool marks. He noted the board's grain and the lack of any paint or sealant. He treated it as vandalism because that was the box his job provided. But as he stood there, he noticed something else. The surrounding woods were too quiet in a way that did not match the hour. The storm had passed days earlier. The afternoon should have carried the small, usual noises. Distant insects, a bird calling from a ridge, wind moving through leaves. There was wind, but it did not make the trees speak. It moved through them without friction, as if sound had been filtered out. Miles checked his own breathing as if he had been holding it. That was when he heard the whistle. It was not loud. It was not melodic. It was not the call of a bird. It was thin and controlled, a single sustained tone that seemed to occupy the space between sounds rather than adding to them. It did not travel like normal noise. It felt as if it appeared inside the skull, the way tinnitus did, except it carried direction, downhill, not straight down the trail but off it, into thicker brush where the slope rolled away into a drainage that was not part of any maintained route. The tone made that direction feel like relief, like a shortcut, like a safer way forward than the narrow, leaf-choked path Miles stood on. He turned his recorder on without thinking, because habit took over when instinct started to argue. Audio captures faint whistle. From a ranger recording, Miles stood still and listened for variation. The whistle did not waver. It held steady, then dipped slightly, then returned, like someone testing whether he had noticed. He took 3 steps toward the trail, then stopped, because the urge to step off route sharpened in a way that felt chemical rather than curious. His mind supplied an image of open ground below, of easier walking, of the trail being a mistake. The sign beside him told him not to listen to the quiet, and he understood, in a sudden cold way, that the message was not metaphor. The quiet was not absence, it was a surface. Miles backed away from the edge of the old trail. The whistle did not follow him with distance the way sound should. It stayed the same volume until he reached a particular point near the service spur, and then it stopped, as if a line had been crossed. He exhaled and realized his hands were trembling, not from fear exactly, but from the sensation of having resisted something that felt simple and correct in the moment. He removed the sign with gloved hands, slid it into an evidence bag, and marked the tree for later inspection. He noted the GPS coordinates and the time. He wrote that the location produced an unusual auditory effect and a strong urge to deviate downhill. He did not describe it as compulsion. He did not write that the whistle felt like it was inside his head. He wrote what could survive a supervisor reading it. Subject reported a sustained faint tone and an urge to deviate off trail. From a field note attachment back at the ranger station, he logged the sign as recovered property. The evidence entry treated it as vandalism with a photograph set and a chain of custody form. The board itself sat on a metal shelf in a storage room that smelled of wet nylon and disinfectant. That should have been the end of it. A warning removed, a path flagged, an odd note filed. Instead, the next report arrived in less than 2 days. 2 hikers, both experienced enough to carry headlamps and water, had gone missing briefly in the same area. They had started on a maintained loop that should have funneled them back toward a parking lot. They did not have a reason to take the abandoned trail. They did not have a reason to leave any trail at all. They were found after an overnight search, disoriented and embarrassed, sitting close together in a shallow hollow downhill from the old path. Their clothing was damp with cold sweat rather than rain. Their hands were scratched from briars. Their gear was intact. They were not injured in a way that explained why they stayed put. They could not describe why they left the trail, only that they both felt certain they were supposed to. 2 hikers deviated and lost. From a search and rescue report, search team leader documented the location where the hikers were found and noted a detail that did not fit weather or terrain. In the mud around the hollow, there were scuffs and partial boot marks that seemed to start and stop without a coherent path, as if the hikers had walked in small circles before sitting down. The pattern suggested hesitation, correction, then a final collapse into stillness. The hikers gave statements that sounded ordinary until one line repeated in both accounts, phrased differently but carrying the same idea. They both described a quiet that felt directed, a quiet that made the downhill slope seem like the only rational choice. I thought the trail was wrong and the woods were right. From a hiker statement, it felt safer to step off, like I was being guided. From a hiker statement, Miles returned to the site with a second ranger and a small team. They did not go in casually this time. They moved as if entering a contaminated area. Short checks, frequent pauses, constant verbal confirmation of position. Miles carried the same recorder, and he wore a small earpiece to monitor it. Live, the trail looked unchanged. The tree where the sign had been nailed was still there, bark scarred by fresh holes. The forest sounded normal at first. Bird calls returned. Wind moved leaves again. The quiet did not announce itself. They walked for less than an hour before the sound returned. Not a whistle yet. First, a thinning of ambient noise, as if someone had turned a dial down on the world. Then, a faint tone, too controlled to be natural, threading between the remaining sounds. The whistle did not come from a point. It came from a direction. Downhill, Miles stopped. The second ranger stopped. The team leader lifted a hand, signaling stillness. They all listened, and in that shared silence, the urge appeared again, not as a thought, but as a certainty that the trail was a mistake and the right move was to step off it. Miles watched the team leader's face tighten. The man was not panicking. He was concentrating. He was resisting. Miles hit a marker flag into the soil and wrote the time in his notebook. He asked one member to take a photograph of the downhill brush line, not because the photo would show anything, but because creating an external record was a way to anchor the mind against internal suggestion. The recorder captured the whistle faintly, then captured something else, the whistle dropping out for half a second and returning with the same pitch, like a loop. Like a track resuming, Miles did not let the team go downhill. He did what the sign had told him to do. He did not listen to the quiet. He treated it as a hazard and turned back. They left the area without incident, but the evidence they brought out was not nothing. It was a recovered sign with modern nails, a set of photographs, a recorder file with a faint sustained tone, a SAR report describing hikers deviating from a trail with no practical reason, and the mountain's message did not stop at one location. Over the following weeks, Miles noticed the whistle as a footnote in other unrelated files, a faint audio layer under a trail cam recording, a mention in a lost hiker statement of a too quiet moment that felt comforting rather than frightening, a deputy's note about a caller who said the woods sounded blank. It did not appear often. It did not need to. It appeared only long enough to suggest that leaving the trail was an act of intelligence. The mountains did not shout. They offered archival transition. After the warning came missing information, pages torn away with precision, as if someone wanted the record to match the gaps in the map. The cabin was not supposed to be a problem. It sat in a narrow gap between 2 ridges in eastern Kentucky, a place where radio reception came and went with weather, and where winter visitors were rare enough that a single set of fresh tire tracks could become a talking point. The structure was old but maintained. The door had a solid deadbolt. The windows were single-pane glass with storm covers. The inside smelled like propane heat, pine cleaner, and paper. Ranger Hollis Yates had worked that district long enough to trust the cabin more than most people. It was a routine stop in bad weather and a stable anchor for patrol shifts that ran long. If something went wrong up there, the cabin was where responders staged. If someone went missing, the cabin's logbook became a timeline. In early winter, Hollis was assigned a quiet task: inventory check, winterize supplies, confirm the emergency kit had not been scavenged by curious locals. The report request came with no urgency. It was paperwork, the kind that kept budgets honest. Hollis arrived just after noon. The access road was thinly iced. The sky was low and gray. The cabin looked normal from the outside. No broken glass, no damage to the eaves, no fresh footprints around the porch. The door was locked. He unlocked it with a key from the district ring, stepped inside, and paused long enough to listen. The heater was off. The air was cold but not stale. The silence felt ordinary, the kind that came from an empty building. He began his checklist: fuel gauge, first aid kit, flares, spare batteries, weather radio. Everything was in place. Nothing looked rummaged. The drawers were shut. The desk held the same stack of forms, the same pen cup, the same laminated trail map pinned to a corkboard. Then he saw the logbook. It sat where it always sat, centered on the desk, aligned with the edge as if someone had squared it by habit. The cover was worn from years of hands. Hollis opened it to the most recent entry and scanned down the lines the way he always did, looking for anything that suggested a problem. The handwriting stopped abruptly in mid-month, then resumed days later in a different hand. That alone was not strange. Rotations happened. Fill-in rangers happened. What made Hollis stop was the physical absence of paper. He turned a page and found a gap. He turned another and found another. It was not a few missing corners or water-damaged sheets. Entire pages had been removed cleanly along the binding, leaving small uniform fibers where the paper had been cut or torn with controlled force. Not random, not angry, not sloppy. Pages removed for dates. From an evidence protocol entry, Hollis flipped back and forth to confirm what he was seeing. The missing pages formed a pattern, clusters of removed sheets separated by normal entries. He pulled a separate small calendar notebook from his jacket pocket and compared the logbook's remaining dates to the gaps. The missing pages were not evenly spaced. They corresponded to specific days. Hollis did not say the word edited out loud, but his mind moved there. The logbook looked like a controlled document that someone had revised after the fact. Someone had removed pages without disturbing anything else. He photographed the binding where pages were missing. He photographed the remaining dates on either side of each gap. He wrote down the spans of time that had been cut out and the exact number of sheets missing in each span. He then did something that made the cabin feel less like a building and more like a scene. He checked the windows for tampering. He checked the door frame for tool marks. He checked the back latch. He checked the floor near the threshold for grit or disturbed dust. There was none. No forced entry. From a ranger report, the cabin had not been broken into in any way that left a conventional story. The lock cylinder was intact. The screws were not new. The hinges were unmarked. The storm covers were still clipped. If someone had entered, they had done so like an owner, not like a thief. Hollis bagged the logbook in a paper evidence sleeve he kept for trail cam SD cards and found property. He locked the cabin, returned to his vehicle, and drove back down to the district office with the logbook on the passenger seat as if it might move on its own if left unattended. At the office, he requested county disappearance records for the same trail system. It was not a dramatic request. It was clerical. But the clerk who pulled the list did it with the mild dread that came with old files. The disappearances were spread across years, each one recorded as its own incident. A hiker separated from a group, a hunter who did not return to a truck, a solo camper who left a tent behind. In most cases, searches had been conducted. In most cases, the mountain offered nothing clean enough to close the file. Hollis laid the disappearance dates beside the logbook's missing spans. The alignment was immediate, not approximate, not convenient, exact. The missing pages corresponded to the days people had vanished. Missing persons list matches. From an archival cross-check note, the match created a new problem that no one wanted to speak directly. The cabin's logbook was not a personal diary. It was a formal record. Who was on duty, what trails were patrolled, what complaints came in, what weather conditions existed, what small anomalies were noticed and dismissed. If those pages were missing, it meant someone had removed potential context. Someone had removed what the record said about those dates. The office began a quiet internal check. They reviewed who had keys. They reviewed key logs. They reviewed maintenance records. They reviewed winter inventory signouts. They found what they always found in rural districts: too much informal access, too much trust, too many years of everyone knows everyone. The cabin key was not supposed to be copied, but supposed to did not mean never. Hollis returned to the cabin 2 days later with a second ranger, a deputy, and a simple goal: confirm nothing else had been touched and look for discarded paper. They approached the cabin from the back trail to avoid leaving vehicle tracks that might confuse later reviews. The snow in the shade held older prints, but none were fresh. The cabin was still locked. The windows were still intact. Inside, the desk looked the same. The absence of pages had not changed, but the feeling in the room had. Once a place became part of an investigation, it no longer felt like shelter. It felt like a staged environment that could be entered, altered, and left without leaving a trace. They searched the cabin carefully for scraps, inside drawers, behind the desk, under the heater, in the small trash bin. Nothing. They checked outside. Behind the cabin, partly covered by leaves and wind-blown debris, was a metal trash barrel used in summer. It was not full. It held a few old wrappers, a cracked plastic bottle, and a cluster of damp paper pressed against the bottom as if it had been thrown in long ago and then forgotten. Hollis lifted the papers with gloved hands. Most were blank forms. One was different. It was a single loose sheet, torn from a larger notebook. The paper was stained, and the stain was not random. It looked like faint map bleed-through, the kind that happened when a page had been pressed hard against a marked chart and ink transferred by pressure rather than by direct writing. The sheet contained partial coordinates, smudged and incomplete, as if someone had tried to erase them and failed. Along the edge was a margin note in hurried block letters, written by someone trying to be precise while moving fast. It referenced a recurring interval. Every 33 minutes, check the marker. Hollis felt his throat tighten, not because of the sentence itself, but because the number had already appeared elsewhere in other files that had started to accumulate in quiet corners of county records. A trail camera that triggered on the same interval, a rhythm that behaved like a schedule. He photographed the sheet where it had been found, then sealed it as an artifact. Recovered loose page with pressure transfer staining and partial coordinates. From an evidence intake note, the deputy photographed the barrel and documented its contents. The second ranger photographed the cabin's locks and windows again, as if repetition could eventually prove the truth through volume. The sheet was taken to the office and stored in a secure cabinet. The logbook was moved to a locked evidence room. A formal request went out to locate the missing pages, but it was the kind of request that lived in emails and died in time. The missing pages were never recovered. No one admitted taking them. No one was identified as having entered the cabin on those dates. No prints were found on the desk. No fibers were found on the binding. The system offered no satisfying culprit. What remained was an edited record and a single discarded page that had slipped through whatever process removed the rest. Hollis wrote a final note for the file, careful with language. He stated that the cabin showed no forced entry. He stated that pages were missing by date. He stated that missing dates aligned with disappearances. He stated that a loose sheet was recovered with partial coordinates and a repeated interval reference. He did not state what he thought. He did not write that the cabin felt used briefly for something other than shelter. He did not write that the mountain had not erased the record entirely. It had curated it. Archival transition. The next file brought the pattern into human sound, a voice that copied the living by repeating them a moment later, like a recording played back by something that had learned language, but not empathy. They chose the hollow because it looked ordinary, a shallow bowl of trees just off a service road, hidden from passing headlights, with a flat patch of leaf litter where someone had camped before. The fire ring was already there, stones blackened by old heat. The ground was packed down in a way that suggested a dozen weekends of quiet use. Nothing about it felt like a warning. The group was 4 friends in their late 20s, the kind of people who took pride in doing things correctly. They brought sealed food. They hung scent items. They kept the fire small. They stayed within the boundaries of what they considered responsible. Their plan was a single night, a reset from long work weeks and crowded rooms. They arrived in early autumn, when the air cooled fast after sunset, and the forest smelled like damp bark and crushed fern. Their phones lost signal about 10 minutes before the pull-off, which did not concern them. It felt like a feature, a reason the place still existed. They built the fire low and controlled. They ate quickly. They talked in the relaxed rhythm of people who believed the night would remain stable if they treated it politely. They told short stories. They laughed once or twice, then quieted as the cold pressed in. The sounds around them were normal. A faint wind in the canopy, occasional leaf fall, the small crackle of wood. If someone had asked them later what the moment felt like, they would have said peaceful, complete. What they did not notice at first was the way the hollow absorbed their voices too cleanly. There were no typical echoes, no bounce-off rock faces. Their words seemed to fall into the darkness and stop, as if the trees were thick enough to eat sound. It made them speak a little louder without realizing it. It made them fill silences quickly. It made the fire feel like the only real thing. Sometime after midnight, one of them spoke a sentence into the firelight and then heard it again, not as an echo, not as a distant reflection, as a repeat. The same words returned from beyond the edge of the light, delayed by a short interval, with the same cadence but missing something that made human speech human. It was too flat on the vowels, too careful on the consonants. It sounded like an imitation assembled from memory. The person who heard it first froze and looked into the darkness as if expecting to see a face. The others heard it a moment later. A second phrase, repeated. A short laugh, repeated. A single name, repeated. It did not respond. It did not answer. It did not change content. It simply played them back, always slightly late, always from a place that stayed just outside the fire's reach. The group did what people do when reality begins to bend. They tried to make it fit something known. They assumed another campsite down the slope. They assumed someone messing with them. They assumed an animal could be producing an odd reflection in the hollow, the way sound sometimes behaved in bowls of land. Then the repeats began to match them too precisely. They tested it without saying they were testing it. One of them spoke a short phrase, then stayed silent and counted in their head. The phrase returned with the same delay. Another said a different phrase, lower, almost under breath. It still returned, clear enough to recognize. They could not locate the source by direction. It seemed to come from everywhere the dark was thickest. It felt like the hollow itself had learned their voices. Someone took a handheld recorder from a gear bag because instinct demanded proof, and because the act of recording felt like doing something that could be measured. They set it on a cooler lid close to the fire ring, pointed toward the tree line. The forest remained quiet for a moment, as if listening. Then again their own words returned, not all of them, not in perfect order, but enough to make their skin tighten, enough to make the hair on arms rise, enough to make the fire suddenly look too small. The delay stayed consistent, a short, repeatable interval, like a system latency. They stopped talking. The repeats continued anyway, faint at first, then clearer, pulling fragments they had spoken earlier out of the air and returning them like a receipt. One of them called emergency services, using the thin chance of signal that sometimes appeared in strange pockets. The call connected for long enough to produce a summary later, the kind of neutral language dispatch used when the content sounded irrational, Voice Mimic reported. From a 911 call summary, the group did not run into the trees. They did not chase the sound. Their instincts moved in the other direction, toward open space and a vehicle and the hard edges of metal and glass. They doused the fire fast, careless with the usual rules. The darkness became total in seconds. They packed nothing but keys and phones. They moved together shoulder to shoulder, not because it was heroic, but because it felt wrong to let one person fall behind. As they walked, the repeats followed, not louder, not closer, present. A phrase returned from the left, then from the right. A name returned from behind. The forest used their language without needing their permission. The delay remained the same, as if the sound had to travel through a process before it could be sent back. When they reached the vehicle, the door locks sounded absurdly loud in the quiet. They got inside, started the engine, and turned on the headlights. The beams cut into trees and brush and showed nothing but leaves. No figure, no reflective eyes, no prank speaker hidden on the ground, only the thin road, the damp shoulder, and the hollow behind them that looked harmless now that it was lit. They drove out too fast. Later in daylight, they listened to the recording. It captured their voices clearly at the start, the normal warmth of human speech near a fire. It captured the shift when the first repeat appeared. A phrase returned with the same inflection but stripped of emotion, as if spoken by a mouth that understood the shape of the words but not their weight. The forensic note attached to the file described it in restrained language. Audio shows delayed repeats. From a forensic audio note, the recording also captured something else in the background during the repeats. A faint, dry clicking sound that seemed to mark time. It was subtle enough that the group did not notice it that night, but it was there on playback, underlying the imitation like a metronome built into the forest. Rangers responded the next day. They walked the hollow, checked for nearby camps, checked the service road for tracks, checked the slope for disturbed brush. They found the remains of the fire, the packed earth where a tent had been, and the lines where 4 sleeping bags had been laid. They found no evidence of another party, no other campers nearby. From a ranger report, they also found no footprints that suggested someone had approached the site during the night. The leaf litter held the group's own movement. It held the marks of their fast departure. It held nothing else. The only artifact that stayed true was the recording. A file with a timestamp, a chain of custody, and voices that returned to themselves with a delay that felt engineered. It proved something happened. It did not prove what had done it. The group never camped in that hollow again. They told the story rarely, and when they did, they always emphasized the same detail. The repeats were worse than any normal echo. An echo was passive. An echo simply happened. This felt like practice, Archival transition. The final case carried the pattern upward into the canopy, where a path appeared from above and vanished from below, like an instruction only machines could see. Miles Arden joined volunteer search operations because he believed in solvable problems. He liked grid lines, he liked checklists, he liked the quiet competence of people who showed up before dawn with radios, water, and the patience to walk the same ridge twice if it meant bringing someone home. He also flew drones. In the Appalachians, that meant trading romance for utility. Drones did not give you cinematic mountains. They gave you practical angles, aerial views of deadfall that could trap a person, heat signatures that might be a rock or might be a body, broken terrain that turned a short hike into an injury. The drone was not magic. It was simply a way to see without bleeding. That is why Miles was invited onto the late summer search for a missing solo backpacker named Carter Delling. Carter had signed a trail register at a remote lot, left a note about a loop route, and then stopped answering messages. His vehicle remained where he parked it. His pack list suggested enough experience to be cautious and enough confidence to be wrong. Ground teams had already combed the obvious corridors. They had checked the ridge trail. They had checked the creek line. They had walked the old spurs that branched off into timber and ended in nothing. Their reports all said the same thing in different language. No clear route, no tracks, no sign. Miles arrived on day 2 with a small folding table, spare batteries, a field laptop, and a drone he had customized for stable flight under canopy edges. He listened to the briefing, noted coordinates, and watched the team leaders try to balance urgency with safety. The last known area was a dense section of forest where the understory grew thick, where radio reception dropped in pockets, and where old logging activity had left confusing lines in the land. They asked him to fly the section because walking it had already produced fatigue and nothing else. Miles launched from a narrow break in the trees, keeping the drone low at first, then climbing above the canopy where the world became a textured surface. From above, the forest looked continuous, a quilt of greens and shadows, broken only by occasional rock and dead snags. He began a methodical sweep. He expected to see natural features, drainage cuts, blowdown lanes, animal trails, maybe a single bright object if the missing hiker had dropped gear, maybe nothing. Then the feed showed something that made him sit forward as if posture alone could correct what he was seeing. A corridor. It ran straight through the canopy in a narrow lane, not wide enough to be a road, not messy enough to be storm damage. Leaves and limbs formed edges like walls. The line was cleaner than any deer trail. It resembled a path drawn into the treetops, visible only as a subtle difference in density and shadow, a long green hallway that did not match the terrain logic below it. Miles stopped the sweep and hovered. The corridor held steady on camera. It showed depth. It showed parallax as the drone drifted slightly. It was not a compression artifact. It was not a glitch. It behaved like a real feature of space. He marked the coordinate and captured still frames and clip segments with metadata intact. Aerial corridor visible. From drone footage metadata notes, the command staff treated it like a lead, because in searches you learn to respect any lead that could be repeated. Ground teams rerouted toward the coordinate. Miles watched them on his mapping overlay, small icons moving through dense terrain, their progress slowed by brush that the drone could not fully reveal. He kept the drone above them, adjusting altitude, trying to align the overhead corridor with the ground reality. The alignment refused. The corridor stayed where it was from above, but when ground teams reached the projected location, they reported nothing resembling a trail. No clear lane, no cut branches, no disturbed leaf litter, no human-made clearing. The understory was thick enough to snag clothing and slow movement to a crawl. Ground search negative. From SAR report text, a mismatch between aerial and ground perspective was not unheard of. Shadows could hide things. terrain could warp perception. But this was not a simple misread. The corridor was too straight, too deliberate, too consistent to be a trick of light. Miles adjusted his flight plan and captured the corridor from multiple angles. He ran the drone parallel to it. He crossed it perpendicular. He altered altitude. He changed camera exposure. The corridor remained visible from above, as if it belonged to the canopy layer alone. Then a ground team leader called him over the radio and reported something else: fresh marks on trees. The team found notches carved at shoulder height on several trunks, spaced like waypoints. The cuts were crisp. The exposed wood looked pale, sap still beaded at the edges. It was not old vandalism softened by rain and time. It was recent enough to feel alive. Tree marks, fresh. From a field inspection note, Miles asked them to photograph the marks with scale references and to flag them discreetly. The team complied. The photos showed shallow angled cuts made by a sharp tool, repeated with the same shape as if someone had a template in mind. The marks formed a line, but not a line that matched any visible trail. They led into brush that did not open. They pointed toward where the corridor existed above them, but on the ground, the line dissolved into thickets and deadfall. It felt like signage without a road. Miles landed the drone to conserve battery and reviewed footage on the laptop, while the team continued ground checks. He replayed the corridor segments frame by frame. He checked for visual noise. He checked for lens flare. He checked for the subtle distortions that could produce false lanes in repeating texture. Nothing explained it. The corridor's edges remained too clean. The shadows inside remained too uniform. The feature behaved like a path in three-dimensional space, but only when observed from above. He launched again and traced the corridor's length. It ran farther than he expected, threading over ridges and dips. At one point, it seemed to narrow, then widen again, like a system adjusting for terrain constraints. Miles began placing digital markers along it, building a line on the map. Then the drone's compass and positioning began to hesitate. The telemetry flickered in a way that made his stomach tighten. Not a full failure, not a crash. A momentary uncertainty, like the drone did not know where it was relative to the ground. He forced himself to stay calm and not anthropomorphize a machine. He reminded himself that magnetism and terrain could distort instruments. He stabilized the drone, shifted position, and regained clean telemetry. But the corridor remained patient and straight, as if it did not care about the drone's confusion. Miles did something he later regretted. He lowered altitude, trying to bring the drone down towards the canopy to see if the corridor could be observed from a closer level. He wanted to know if it was a feature of the highest leaves, or if it descended into the understory. As the drone dipped, the corridor's edges sharpened. The space inside it seemed darker than the surrounding canopy, not because of shadow alone, but because the leaves formed a ceiling over an emptier channel. It looked briefly like a tunnel in green. Then, for the first time, Miles saw something else inside it. Not a person, not a body, a movement in the corridor's depth that did not break leaves or sway branches, but suggested weight passing through air. The camera could not resolve detail, but the motion was there, traveling along the corridor's axis, steady and unhurried. Miles captured the clip, then immediately climbed altitude, forcing distance between his machine and the feature. He did not tell himself it was a bird. Birds broke branches and flashed wings. This did neither. He told himself it might be wind pushing through a lane. But the surrounding canopy remained still. Miles did not have a word that fit, so he returned to procedure. He documented, he saved the footage. He saved the telemetry log. He wrote a short field note with times and conditions. He asked the ground team to collect a bark shaving from one marked trunk using a clean bag. Because the physical world mattered in case files, the ground team complied and sealed the sample. The exposed wood on the shaving still held tacky sap, confirming what they already knew. The cut was fresh. The sample became an artifact, small, unimpressive, and heavy with implication. The search continued through the day and into the next. The corridor persisted in drone feeds, yet refused to become a walkable trail. Ground teams remained unable to find a matching lane. They followed the line of tree marks until it led them into brush that grew denser with each step, then stopped because pushing farther would risk injury without clear gain. Carter Delling was never located, not by drone, not by foot, not by dogs, not by luck. His absence turned the corridor from a curiosity into a question with consequences. In the final after-action notes, the corridor was mentioned carefully. It was described as an aerial anomaly with no ground confirmation. It was described as a possible canopy feature created by tree growth patterns. It was described as inconclusive. Miles kept his private copy of the footage anyway. Weeks later, when investigators and volunteers reviewed the season's unusual incidents, the corridor refused to stay isolated. It aligned too neatly with other files from the region. The compass that spun against one wall, the lift button that lit without power, the helmet carrying soil from another place, the trail camera that triggered on the same interval, the wet handprint with no rain, the sign warning against quiet, the ranger logbook missing pages by date, the campfire that heard its own words return, different locations, different witnesses, shared behavior. The mountains did not feel like a haunted house in these reports. They felt like a system that could mark routes, erase proof, and control what could be perceived depending on perspective. From above, the corridor offered a line. From below, it offered nothing. And in the drone footage, it offered something worse than nothing. The suggestion that there was a way through the forest that did not belong to hikers but could still be seen by their tools. Miles filed the case under volunteer protocol and then kept watching the corridor clips late at night, listening to the audio track even though it was mostly wind noise. On one replay, at a low volume, he thought he heard a faint pattern beneath the wind, a thin rhythmic tick that his brain wanted to turn into counting. He did not elevate it to evidence. He did not claim it was real. He simply stopped listening. Because once a system learned what you noticed, it had a way of noticing you back. If you want more archived case files like these, tell us which story stayed with you the longest and why. Subscribe to Black Pine Archives for the next set of records we were not supposed to find.